I'm Sam Sachs in for Tom Hartman in Washington, D.C., and here's what's coming up tonight on The Big Picture. This morning, Ecuador announced that it would grant Julian Assange political asylum. The only problem? The UK won't let him leave. But beyond Assange's fate, what kind of ramifications will this saga have on journalism and whistleblowers in particular around the world? Also, a century ago, Americans gained the right to directly elect their senators through the 17th Amendment, instead of state legislatures doing the job for them. But now Republicans want to strip us of that right, too. What's their grand scheme here? And Mitt Romney has a ton of character flaws, but tying a dog to the roof of a car? Yeah, I'd say that tops them all. Will this insane lapse in judgment by Romney hurt him in November? And how is one band trying to make sure that happens? Joel Casale of Devo joins me later in the show. And we begin tonight with Julian Assange. Here was Ecuador's Foreign Minister Ricardo Patino announcing this morning that his nation will grant Assange political asylum.
The Ecuadorian government is defending its right to protect Assange, and we have decided to grant political asylum to him. The UK government should respect the decision of the Ecuadorian government.
Assange, who's been holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy for about 2 months, called the decision a significant victory. But it comes with the price tag of damaged international relations between Ecuador on one side and the UK and Sweden and the United States on the other side. On Wednesday night, the British government threatened Ecuador, warning that should asylum be granted to Assange, the British government reserves the right to storm the Ecuadorian embassy in London, which is sovereign territory, and arrest Assange. Now, they've since walked back that threat, following a harsh rebuke of it by Ecuador. But the UK isn't backing down on its promise to extradite Assange to Sweden. After the announcement in Ecuador, British Foreign Secretary William Hague announced that the UK will not grant Assange safe passage out of the country to Ecuador. And the moment Assange steps foot outside the embassy and on the streets of London, he will be arrested and extradited to Sweden. So tonight, Assange remains in London's Ecuadorian embassy, perhaps entertaining some creative ideas on how to slip by British police and escape off to Ecuador. Now, you might remember Assange fled to the embassy back in June once it became clear that he could not save himself from extradition to Sweden working within British courts. He's wanted in Sweden for questioning regarding allegations of sexual assault. But it's long been speculated that the real reason Sweden wants Assange is to eventually extradite him to the United States, where he could face charges of espionage and treason related to his work at WikiLeaks and the release of hundreds of thousands of State Department cables last year. That was the basis of Assange's appeal for asylum. And it was on this basis that Ecuador granted that asylum. But here are some really important things you have to know about this case and how it's gotten to this point. One, Julian Assange has not been charged with any crime in Sweden. He's wanted for questioning regarding sexual assault allegations. But again, he's not facing any charges for any crimes. Two, Assange has made himself available in London to meet with Swedish investigators to answer those questions regarding the sexual assault allegations. But Sweden has refused to meet with him. And three, Assange has offered to go to Stockholm and again answer questions on these allegations as long as he receives a guarantee that he will not be extradited to the United States. That guarantee could not be made by Sweden or the United States. Those three facts played a big role in Ecuador's decision to grant Assange asylum, an asylum that both the British and Swedish governments seem prepared to reject and a slap in the face of international law. So this story is now bigger than just the fate of Julian Assange. It now has international implications, and it also has implications for the future of free information activism, journalism, and whistleblower protections. To speak to those issues, I'm now joined by Jesselyn Radic, National Security and Human Rights Director at the Government Accountability Project, and author of the book, Traitor, the Whistleblower in the American Taliban. Jesselyn, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you on. So first, on asylum being granted, this was really pretty much an easy decision by Ecuador, wasn't it?
You know, I don't
more,
think
principally not an easy decision, but based on
well, in terms of
criteria.
asylum criteria, I think this was an easy decision. Politically, I think it was a very difficult and bold
brave
and incredibly courageous decision by Ecuador to grant asylum. I mean, clearly Assange fit the criteria.
What is kind of the criteria there's?
The main three criteria are a valid fear of political persecution, 4 protected categories, including political opinion, and 3, the inability of the government to stop that. So clearly Assange met those criteria, but for a little country like Ecuador to be able to stand up against the pressure coming from the UK and the US is quite extraordinary.
Exactly. I shouldn't have said it was an easy decision. It was a very brave, hard decision to make, but strictly based on the criteria, I mean, it seems like definitely the right call. Isn't in Foreign Minister Patino's announcement today, he referenced how he tried to work with Sweden, he tried to work with the UK, and he reached out to the United States even, and basically didn't get anywhere with them. Doesn't that suggest that Assange's fears that this is what was going on the whole time? They wanted to get him to Sweden, to get him to the United States eventually. Doesn't that kind of prove that point?
Well, I think it definitely validates that he had a well-founded fear of political persecution because he made himself available for questioning, which is what Sweden said it wanted, but what many believe to be a pretext to get him extradited over there, to be extradited to the U.S. So I think it very much proves the point, and the fact that the UK stood poised to invade the embassy at one point would have been such an extreme, unprecedented in history. As such an extreme act. I mean, the world was watching. Maybe the U.S. was not watching in the mainstream media, but the world was certainly watching this drama unfold.
Yeah, absolutely. And Assange called this a significant victory, and I don't think he's talking about his own fate, that this was a significant victory. This is a significant victory, it seems, for the work he's doing, which has been questioned here in the United States as an enemy of the state. He's been questioned as a traitor. And yet here we have a country that's standing up to it. What does this decision by Ecuador mean for the future of whistleblowers like people you've represented and people like Julian Assange who are working to have free information out there?
Well, it's hard to know about. I mean, it definitely was a victory for free speech and for a free press. And in Ecuador's decision, as articulated by Ricardo Patino, he said WikiLeaks is a publisher. It is a news outlet, something that the mainstream media in the U.S. has argued against vehemently.
It's the same thing as the New York Times, essentially.
Yes, and they've constantly tried to differentiate themselves, the mainstream media, from Julian Assange. I think what they fail to realize is that if Assange and or WikiLeaks goes down, domino effect, Absolutely. New York Times is next, and everybody else has reprinted all of this so-called useless information from WikiLeaks. But it was a huge victory for free speech, and at the same time, though, I don't know how it bodes for whistleblowers, because part of the decision, again, as articulated by Patino, was looking at how Bradley Manning was being treated in the U.S., number one, looking at the war on whistleblowers going on in the U.S., number two, and number three, looking at the general anti-leak hysteria that is currently sweeping our nation and threatening anti-leak legislation that would be quite draconian.
Absolutely. This is definitely an interesting time, and here we have someone seeking asylum from Western countries. That could be a sign of a changing world right there.
Yes,
Jocelyn,
absolutely.
We're out of time. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Back in 2010, when Assange really achieved notoriety for his work at WikiLeaks, Tom connected the mission Assange is on with the fight against corporate power. Take a look.
Looking at his writings, it's clear what motivates Assange. In 2007, he wrote a piece entitled "The United What of America," in which he examined corporate structure and how it is intrinsically authoritarian. His piece is even more poignant after the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision that pretty much handed our government over to corporate rule. In Assange's words, That corporate rule looks like this. These are the characteristics of a corporation. Suffrage, the right to vote, does not exist except for landholders, shareholders. And even there, voting power is in proportion to their ownership. All executive power flows from a central committee. Female representation is almost unknown. There's no divisions of powers. There's no fourth estate, no press. There are no juries, and innocence is not presumed. Failure to submit to any order can result in instant exile. There is no freedom of speech, no right of association. Love is forbidden without state approval. Just starting to sound like something, something from our distant past. The economy is centrally planned. There is pervasive surveillance of movement and electronic communications. The society is heavily regulated, and this regulation is enforced to the degree many employees are told when, where, and how many times a day they can go to the toilet. This is corporate America we're talking about. There is almost no transparency, and something like the Freedom of Information Act is unimaginable. The corporate state, this state has one party. Opposition groups, unions, are banned, surveilled, or marginalized whenever and wherever possible. This is the path our country is on as corporations play a bigger and bigger role in politics, thanks to our Supreme Court. And this is what Julian Assange is standing up against. It's the secrecy that exists within corporate rule. It's the threat to democracy, and it's the threat to freedom. Assange is the world's whistleblower, an occupation that used to be respected and applauded in America. There haven't been adversarial journalists in this country since Woodward and Bernstein and Jack Anderson back in the 70s. Whatever happens to Assange, whatever the end game is, the can of worms is already open. Copycat sites are popping up around the globe. Secrets revealed from South America to Africa. So even if he's picked up by Interpol and rots in prison or simply spends the rest of his life jumping around the globe out of touch, WikiLeaks has changed the way the world works. For all the corporations and governments, if you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to worry about. But for everyone else, the secrets will be revealed. Transparency now rules the day, as Assange himself has stated. The aim of WikiLeaks is to achieve just reform around the world and do it through the mechanism of transparency. And I support his endeavor.
Coming up, before the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913, voters didn't elect senators. State legislatures chose them. A century later, Republicans are saying we should do away with the 17th Amendment and have states choose senators once again. So just what the heck are these right-wingers up to now?
Pepper spray, that just burns your eyes, right?
Right. I mean, it's like a derivative of actual pepper. It's a food product, essentially.
This is much stronger than anything you'd buy as a food.
Absolutely. It's thousands of times stronger than any kind of hot pepper you've ever put in your mouth.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Tom Hartman. Welcome to The Big Picture.
The internal military mechanisms do not work to bring justice or accountability.
I have every right to know what my government's doing. You want to know why? I pay taxes.
Well, I would characterize Obama as a charismatic version of American exceptionalism.
In November, voters, at least those who haven't been disenfranchised by Republican-backed voter ID laws, will hit the polls to select a new president of the United States. But that's not all. The entire House of Representatives is up for re-election as well, as are 33 United States senators. Well, actually, if we're up to a growing number of Republicans, voters wouldn't have a say in those 33 Senate elections. That might sound a little strange, but in fact, prior to the ratification of the 17th Amendment in 1913, voters didn't have a say in who their senator was. Instead, powerful state legislatures appointed senators to go to Washington. That's how things worked, from the ratification of our Constitution all the way up until about 100 years ago. Only after the 17th Amendment was ratified, which allowed for direct election of United States senators by we the people, did we all actually have a say in who represents us in the upper chamber. And now, strangely, a lot of Republicans are saying that amendment was a bad idea, and we should go back to the old days when senators were elected without elections. Joining me now to get to the bottom of what exactly is going on here is Alex Seitzwald, political staff writer at Salon, whose latest article is on this very topic. Alex, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So who's been coming out against the 17th Amendment now, and I guess the big question is why?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's been kind of floating around in the fringe for almost 50 years, starting with the John Birch Society back in the 1960s. But then, like a lot of those kinds of ideas, they became somewhat mainstream with the Tea Party. And now we have a surprisingly large number of Senate candidates who kind of want to invalidate their own senatorial election. Jeff Flake, who's a congressman in Arizona, Pete Hoekstra, another congressman in Michigan. These guys are all running for the Senate now, along with Todd Akin, who's running in Missouri, and another congressman. They've all come out and said that things were better before the 17th Amendment, when state legislatures elected people, elected senators directly. And there's been other people. Antonin Scalia, the Supreme Court justice, has also voiced some support here, along with Rick Perry, who has lots of wonderful views on the Constitution. And I think this new wave is kind of about the Tea Party, revisionist history and this kind of fetishization of the founding fathers and going back to how things were, ignoring all the problems that there were in the original Constitution and the original founders' ideas.
Yeah, it seems strange that you're going to be running for Senate trying to get votes by telling people they shouldn't have a right to vote for you, but you can't, I guess, understand the way the Tea Party operates. But we've seen with the Tea Party this same sort of thing. We've seen them trying to repeal the 16th Amendment for income taxes, the 14th Amendment for the people to for immigration to solve anchor babies or whatever they call them. What's the overarching goal here? Is this to make it, I mean, you kind of, I think, hint at it in your article. You say something like it's much easier for the wealthy to bribe a handful of state legislators than it is to try and bribe an entire electorate. Is that kind of what's going on here?
Yeah, well, so what they say is the purpose is that this is all about states' rights. Of course, conservatives love states' rights. And the idea is that if you let state legislatures elect senators, then the senators will be more beholden to the interests of the states. They'll be, they'll have to go back to the states, and their bosses will be in the state government. So they'll be more responsive to the direct needs of the state. They won't go to Washington and kind of forget about what's going on at home. But the huge problem with this, whether these Tea Party people who are supporting this realize this, and this is actually the ulterior motive or not, I won't say. But before the 17th Amendment, there was rampant corruption in the election of senators. I mean, the whole reason that we have the 17th Amendment is not because it was undemocratic beforehand. It certainly was, but because the corruption was so out of control with bribery and all kinds of terrible things going on that there was this uprising, and people said we can't support this. Because if you think about it, the cost per vote ratio that you have to do if you want to influence an election is so much smaller. You now only need to reach a handful of state lawmakers instead of trying to run ads and reach every voter in the state. I mean, so there was, outright corruption in the most obvious and base terms. There were completely unqualified people being elected to the Senate, basically corporate tools, people who were elected, sent to Washington specifically to do the bidding of corporations. So whether they realize that or not, I mean, that's the kind of thing that we would be looking at if we actually got rid of the 17th Amendment.
Yeah, you relay a story about Grover Cleveland when he was woken up by his wife and said there's burglars in the house. He's like, no, they're all in the Senate. Do you see a connection here between this call for repealing the 17th Amendment and the voter ID laws that are going on around the country?
Yeah, I think there definitely is something, a kind of common strain there in a move towards an undemocratic, the lowercase d, not as in the party, but an undemocratic push. You know, it's this kind of notion that I think you see bubbling up in some Tea Party circles, even if lawmakers won't say it. If you go to Tea Party rallies and you talk to people, as I have, it's right there underneath the surface, which is kind of the idea that people who don't pay taxes, who receive government benefits, they aren't full citizens. They don't really deserve, you know, full representation.
Yeah, and there's no really right to vote, unfortunately, that we've been guaranteed to try and remedy these problems. But we're fresh out of time, Alex. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks.
Yep.